"I'll have you walking again, Mate," the grease-covered mechanic said. Eleanor Harrington Smythe, the wealthiest woman in the city, burst into hysterical laughter from her titanium wheelchair. But when he revealed who he really was, her laughter froze forever. Eleanor Harrington Smythe adjusted the diamond clasp on her imported silk blouse as her driver wheeled her custom titanium chair into Jazz's automotive repairs. The place reeked of burnt oil, sweat, and honest hard yakka, three things she had learned to despise during her 42 years of privileged life. Her $500 R.M. Williams boots barely brushed the chrome footrests of her chair, as if even in her condition she refused to be fully connected to something as ordinary as the floor. Miss Harrington Smythe, Gary, her trusted driver, spoke with that permanently apologetic tone all her staff had perfected. "I remind you, the Porsche is at the official dealership. This place is just temporary while we wait for the imported German parts." "I'm not interested in your explanation, Gary," Eleanor replied, without even looking at him, her eyes sweeping the workshop with the same disgust she would use to inspect a council rubbish dump. "Just ensure no one touches my Bentley with their filthy mitts, and I want out of this bloody hole in under 30 minutes. Jazz's Automotive Repairs was a 2-story building with brick walls that were once cream, but now showed the stains of time and graft. 3 hydraulic hoists held vehicles in various stages of repair, and the metallic clang of tools against metal created an industrial symphony. Eleanor found absolutely repugnant. Several mechanics worked intently, their blue overalls stained with oil, their faces marked by the sun and the effort of earning an honest crust. But what bothered Eleanor most wasn't the place itself, but the simple fact of being there. For the past 8 years, since the polo accident that had shattered her spine and confined her to this chair, Eleanor had developed a perfect system to never have to interact with common folk. She had a full-time driver, 3 personal assistants, a private medical team living in her Point Piper mansion, and enough dough to ensure the world came to her. Not the other way around. "G'day," a male voice interrupted her disgusted thoughts. "How can we help you, Mate?" Eleanor looked up, and what she saw confirmed every one of her prejudices. The man approaching was a mechanic around 35, with slightly long dark hair, a 3-day stubble that urgently needed a professional shave, and blue overalls so covered in grease they looked like they'd never seen a washing machine. His hands were covered in grime, and he wore a spanner hanging from his belt, like it was a sword. But what truly irritated Eleanor was his smile. It was genuine, warm, the sort of smile that suggested this man actually enjoyed his job and his life, despite being obviously poor and uneducated. "Are you the owner?" Eleanor asked. With that tone she had perfected over decades, a tone that made it clear she considered the person in front of her as something she had found stuck to the sole of her shoe. "I'm Jared O'Connell." The man extended his hand, and then, noticing the grease, withdrew it with an embarrassed laugh. "Sorry, that's a bit rough." "Yeah, this is my garage. My old man started it 30 years ago, and I inherited it 5 years back." "How charming," Eleanor drawled the word, as if it were poison. "My Bentley has a minor electrical issue. I need you to check it quickly, and we're leaving, without touching anything else. Understood?" "Gotcha." Jared nodded, but Eleanor noticed something odd in his eyes. There wasn't the fearful submission she expected from people of his class. There was something else, something that looked almost like pity. That infuriated her even more. "Righto, Miss Harrington Smythe." Jared walked over to the black Bentley Continental GT that Gary had carefully parked by the entrance. "What specific symptoms have you noticed?" "I haven't noticed anything," Eleanor replied with irritation. Gary noticed the dashboard lights flickering. "I don't stoop to noticing mechanical problems. That's why I employ people." As Jared opened the Bentley's bonnet, Eleanor watched his every move with absolute suspicion. His hands, despite the grease, moved with a precision and confidence that suggested years of experience. He connected an electronic diagnostic tool and began checking error codes with a concentration Eleanor found vaguely annoying. How dare this man be so focused on his work when she was present? "Miss Harrington Smythe," Jared spoke after several minutes, his voice calm but professional. "The issue is more complex than it appears. The body control module has an intermittent fault, causing short circuits across several systems. It's not immediately dangerous, but it needs replacing." "And how long will that take?" Eleanor asked with mounting impatience. "If I order the part today, it should arrive in a week. The installation job will take about 4 hours." "A week?" Eleanor practically shrieked. "Are you completely mad? I need my car now." "I understand your frustration, Mom." Jared maintained his calm tone, which irritated Eleanor further. But these parts come directly from England. They're specialized components, not stocked locally. I don't care where they come from. Eleanor slammed her fist on the armrest of her chair. Call whoever you have to call. Pay whatever you have to pay. But get that part here tomorrow. Jared looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. The professional patience was giving way to something more critical, more evaluative. Miss Harrington Smythe, he said finally, I gather you're used to things working according to your will. But physics and logistics don't respond to shouting or money. The part will arrive when it arrives. The silence that followed was so tense that even Gary, accustomed to Eleanor's explosions, involuntarily took a step back. How dare you speak to me like that? Eleanor hissed, her face reddening. Do you have any idea who I am? Yeah, Jared replied with a calmness more devastating than any shout. You're Eleanor Harrington Smythe, heiress to the Harrington Resources fortune, director of 6 companies, and, according to the news, one of the richest women in the country. You're also someone who apparently never learned that respect isn't bought with a big wad of cash. Eleanor gasped. For 8 years, no one, absolutely no one, had spoken to her like that. Her wealth had built a protective wall where every word was measured, every interaction controlled. Every person knew exactly how far they could go. I will destroy you. Eleanor spat each word with pure venom. I will ensure you never work in this city again. I will buy this building and flatten it. I will make your life a living hell. You can have a crack. Jared shrugged, returning to check the engine. But it still won't make your car part arrive any quicker. It was then that Eleanor noticed something. On the garage wall, behind Jared, there were several framed diplomas. They were hard to see clearly from where she was, but one of them seemed to bear a university seal. A mechanic with a university degree? Impossible. What are those papers on the wall? She asked, her curiosity temporarily overcoming her fury. Jared followed her gaze and smiled slightly. Souvenirs from another life. What does that mean? It means we all have stories we'd rather not tell, Miss Harrington Smythe. You have yours, I have mine. The cryptic answer only intensified Eleanor's irritation. She hated not knowing things. She hated feeling that someone had information she didn't control. It was in that moment of absolute tension that something happened that would change everything. Eleanor, in her rage, tried to abruptly wheel her chair forward to get away from Jared, but one of the wheels hit a small rise in the uneven workshop floor. The chair tilted dangerously sideways. Eleanor cried out, her hands desperately reaching for something to grab. Gary was too far away. The other mechanics hadn't noticed. It all happened in slow motion, but before the chair completely toppled, Jared moved. It wasn't a casual or clumsy movement. It was precise, calculated, perfect. In an instant, he was beside her, his arms supporting her with a firmness that suggested professional training. He stabilized the chair with impossible ease. And in the process, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years, her muscles. Jared had held her in a way that pressed certain points on her back, and for a fraction of a second, she had felt something. Not pain, not the usual nothingness, but a real, tangible sensation. Are you all right? Jared asked, ensuring the chair was completely stable before letting go. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She was processing what had just happened. The doctors had been clear. Her spinal cord injury was complete, no sensation below the waist. It was permanent, irreversible, final. But she had just felt something. What did you do? She whispered, her voice trembling. Stopped you from having a tumble, Jared replied, clearly confused by the question. No. Eleanor grabbed his arm with surprising strength. How did you hold me? Where exactly did you put your hands? Jared blinked, even more confused. I braced your mid-back and stabilized your weight by distributing it through specific pressure points. It's basic injury prevention technique. I learned it in... He stopped abruptly, as if he had been about to reveal something he preferred to keep hidden. Learned it where? Eleanor pressed, all her attention now focused on this strange mechanic who had just made her feel something the world's best neurosurgeons had told her was impossible. Jared stepped back, his expression guarded. In workplace safety training, all mechanics learn basic first aid techniques. It was an obvious lie. Eleanor had known liars all her life. She had made fortunes identifying when people concealed information. This man was lying, and that only intensified her curiosity. I felt something, Jared, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. When you held me, I felt something in my back. The doctors say that's impossible. Jared looked at her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something change in his eyes. It was as if he was making a decision, evaluating options, calculating risks. Doctors are usually right, he said finally, but his tone suggested there was much more he wasn't saying. Don't lie to me, Jared, Eleanor ordered, but for the first time in years, it wasn't an order based on arrogance, but on genuine desperation. What exactly did you just do? Jared sighed deeply, like a man who knew he was about to cross a bridge he couldn't uncross. Miss Harrington Smythe, he began slowly. Can I ask you a few questions about your injury? Why would a mechanic want to know about my injury? Eleanor countered, but there was less venom in her voice. Now there was something else, a small, fragile hope. Because before I was a mechanic, Jared paused meaningfully, I was a few other things, and those other things taught me to recognize certain patterns. Your injury was classified as complete? Eleanor nodded slowly. Complete T6, total paraplegia, no sensation, no movement, no hope. And did the doctors run tests for residual neurological function? The question was so specific, so technical, that Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, ironically, in the part where she supposedly couldn't feel anything. How do you know those terms? She asked. Answer the question, please. Yes. Multiple tests. MRIs, EMGs, evoked potentials. Everything confirmed a complete injury. Jared nodded thoughtfully, as if processing complex information. Then he did something completely unexpected. He knelt in front of her chair, completely ignoring the fact that his already dirty overalls now became even more soiled against the greasy floor. Miss Harrington Smythe, he said with a seriousness that contrasted dramatically with his ordinary mechanic's appearance. I'm going to tell you something you'll probably think is nuts. You can laugh at me, you can threaten to destroy me again, but I need to say it anyway. Eleanor waited, her heart beating with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. I can have you walking again. The silence that followed was so absolute that Eleanor could hear the buzz of the workshop's fluorescent lights. Then, like a wave finally breaking against the shore, she began to laugh. It wasn't a delicate or restrained laugh. It was a hysterical roar, the kind of laughter that erupts when something is so absurd, so ridiculously impossible, that the mind has no other available response. You! Eleanor could barely speak between gasps. You, a grease-covered mechanic, who can barely string a proper sentence together, are going to do what the best neurosurgeons at the University of Sydney, RPA, and St. Vincent's said was impossible? Jared didn't move. He didn't respond. He simply looked at her with that serene expression that was beginning to deeply irritate Eleanor. This is incredible. Eleanor continued laughing, tears streaming down her cheeks. Gary, did you hear that? This man thinks he can make me walk. With what? Motor oil and a spanner? Gary looked deeply uncomfortable, unsure whether to laugh with his boss or defend the mechanic who had been professional with them. But the other mechanics had heard, and instead of laughing or making mocking comments, they had all stopped working. They were looking at Jared with expressions Eleanor couldn't interpret. It wasn't mockery or disbelief, it was something closer to respect, a shared knowledge she didn't understand. I'm done. Eleanor finally controlled her laughter, wiping her tears. That's enough entertainment for one day. Gary, let's go. We'll find another garage. I can prove it, Jared said calmly. Eleanor stopped, in the process of turning to leave. Excuse me? I can prove to you there is residual neurological activity in your spinal cord, right here, right now, without elaborate medical gear. The absolute audacity of the claim left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Then, something shifted in her expression. It was curiosity mixed with that kind of cruelty that arises when someone wants to see another fail spectacularly. All right, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'll give you exactly 5 minutes to prove your ridiculous claim. And when you fail, and you will fail, because this is absolute madness, I'll enjoy watching as I destroy your life piece by bloody piece. Fair enough. Jared nodded. May I touch your back? I need to do some manual assessments. Eleanor hesitated. For 8 years, only her private medical team had touched her back. But the combination of morbid curiosity and the desire to see this man crash and burn overcame her resistance. Go ahead. Have your best crack at making me walk, miracle mechanic. Jared moved behind her chair. This might feel a bit weird, he warned. I'm going to apply pressure to specific points on your spine. If you feel anything at all, even if it seems insignificant, tell me. I won't feel a thing, Eleanor replied with absolute certainty. Because there's nothing to feel, Jared began. His hands, despite the surface grease, moved with a precision that was clearly medical. He pressed specific points along her spine, starting at the top and moving systematically downwards. And then, When he reached a specific spot, just below where her injury had occurred, it happened. Eleanor felt something. It wasn't pain. It wasn't exactly a sensation of touch either. It was more like an echo, as if someone was knocking on a door in a room she had assumed was completely empty and sealed. "Did you feel that?" Jared asked, his voice now completely professional, clinical. "I don't know what I felt," Eleanor admitted, her voice trembling. "Let's try something else," Jared continued. "I'm going to apply a technique called proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. It's a rehab method that uses sensory receptors to activate dormant neurological pathways." The medical terms flowed from his mouth with the fluency of someone who had used them for years. Eleanor felt as if the world was spinning around her. Over the next few minutes, Jared performed a series of maneuvers and tests that clearly required advanced medical training. At several moments, Eleanor felt those same strange echoes, those sensations that shouldn't exist according to everything the world's best doctors had told her. When he finished, Jared moved in front of her again, his expression now completely serious. "Miss Harrington Smythe," he said, "your injury is not as complete as they told you. There is residual neurological activity, not much, but it's there. With the right treatment, with the proper rehabilitation, there is a small but real chance of partial recovery." Eleanor stared at him as if he were a ghost, an impossible thing made flesh. "Who are you?" she whispered. Jared stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that only made them dirtier. Someone who also has stories they'd rather not tell. "But I'll tell you this. If you really want to explore the possibility of recovery, I'll need to see your full medical records, and you'll need to be willing to work harder than you have in your entire life." "You're a doctor," Eleanor stated rather than asked. Jared didn't answer directly. "The 5 minutes are up. Do you still want to destroy my life?" Eleanor opened her mouth to reply, but no sound came out. For the first time in 8 years, she didn't have a ready answer. She didn't have a plan of action. She didn't have absolute control of the situation. Because this grease-covered mechanic, this man she had scorned and threatened, had just done something the world's best doctors had told her was utterly impossible. He had given her hope. And now, as she looked at him with a mix of astonishment, fear, and something that might have been involuntary respect, Eleanor Harrington Smythe had to confront a devastating truth. She had completely misjudged this man. The question now was, what else had she been misjudging her entire life? Why? Eleanor finally found her voice, though it sounded strange, even to her own ears. "Why would you help me after how I treated you?" Jared smiled sadly. "Because unlike you, Miss Harrington Smythe, I don't judge people's worth by their bank account or their behavior on a bad day. I judge by their potential for change." The words hung in the workshop air like a gentle but devastating accusation. Eleanor knew in that moment that her life had just changed forever, she just didn't know how much yet. The next 3 days were the strangest in Eleanor Harrington Smythe's life. After the encounter at the garage, she had returned to her mansion in complete silence, ignoring Gary's worried questions. She had locked herself in her private study, a space with high ceilings and panoramic windows, offering views of the city she practically owned, but which had never felt so distant as in that moment. On her solid mahogany desk lay her laptop, and on the screen, 3 digital medical files were open simultaneously. They were her complete records from the last 8 years. Dozens of MRIs, reports from world-renowned neurosurgeons, evaluations from spinal cord injury specialists, all reaching the same devastating conclusion. Complete injury, irreversible, permanent. But she had felt something, those strange echoes Jared had evoked with his precise hands. And more than that, she had seen something in his eyes that the world's most expensive doctors had never shown. Genuine certainty mixed with deep understanding of something beyond the numbers in a report. Her private phone, the one only 5 people in the world knew, vibrated. It was her personal assistant, Margaret. "Miss Harrington Smythe, I found something interesting about Jared O'Connell." Eleanor straightened in her chair. "Speak. There's not much in public records. The garage has been in his name for 5 years, inherited from his father. But I found something in old newspaper archives. 10 years ago, there was a doctor, Jared O'Connell, at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. He was a neurosurgery registrar, one of the brightest, according to the notes I found. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. And then he disappeared. He left the residency program halfway through the final year. There's no official explanation. It's as if he simply decided to stop being a doctor and become a mechanic. Why would anyone do that? Eleanor muttered, more to herself than to Margaret. "Keep digging." "But ma'am, there's something else. I found an article from 9 years ago." Jared O'Connell's father, Patrick O'Connell, the owner of the garage, had a serious accident. He was in a coma for weeks. The article mentions that his son left everything to care for him. The pieces were starting to fit. A brilliant neurosurgeon abandons his career to care for his sick father, a man who clearly had the knowledge and skills, but had chosen a completely different life. "Margaret, prep the car. We're going back to the garage." "Are you sure, ma'am? I thought you said you'd never return to that place." "I've changed my mind." "And Margaret, investigate deeper. I want to know exactly what happened 9 years ago." 2 hours later, Eleanor was back at Jazz's automotive repairs, but this time her attitude was different. She didn't arrive with demands or threats. She arrived with questions. Jared was underneath an old Toyota, only his legs visible as he worked. When he heard the wheels of Eleanor's chair approaching, he slid out with an expression of genuine surprise. "Miss Harrington Smythe, I didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to be here either," Eleanor admitted. For the first time, she truly looked at the workshop, not with disgust, but with curiosity. The other mechanics worked with a coordinated efficiency that spoke of mutual respect and effective leadership. The place was clean, despite the nature of the work, and in the small adjoining office, there could have been shelves full of technical manuals, but there were also medical books. "I need to talk to you," Eleanor said, privately. Jared wiped his hands on a rag and led her into his office. It was a small space with a metal desk, an old but functional computer, and those walls full of diplomas she had noted earlier. Now, with the implicit permission to be there, Eleanor read them carefully. Bachelor of Medicine, University of Sydney. Specialist Certificate in Neurosurgery. Academic Honours. Mentions of Distinction. All in the name of Dr. Jared Alexander O'Connell. "You were a neurosurgeon," Eleanor stated, looking at the diplomas. "I was many things," Jared replied, sitting in his worn chair. "Now I'm a mechanic." "Why? Why did you leave medicine? Or why did you accept being a mechanic?" "Both." Jared leaned back, his eyes distant with memories that clearly hurt. "My father had an accident 9 years ago, severe traumatic brain injury. The doctors said he had no hope, that we should let him go. But I knew they were wrong. I could see signs they were overlooking, neurological patterns that indicated residual brain activity. And what did you do?" "I left my residency. I took control of his treatment. For a full year, I was with him every day, applying neurological rehabilitation techniques I had studied, but which most doctors consider too experimental or laborious. And it worked." My father woke up. Eleanor felt something strange moving in her chest. It was empathy, an emotion she had successfully suppressed for years. "But there's more to the story," Jared continued, his voice growing tense. "While caring for my father, the hospital where I worked pressured me to return. They said I was wasting my talent, that my father was a lost cause. When I refused, when I insisted there was hope where they saw none, they started an investigation into my professional competence." "Did they take your license?" "They didn't go that far, but it became clear that if I returned, I would always be the doctor who abandoned his patients, who prioritized emotion over science. My reputation was ruined before it even really began, so I decided not to go back." "And the garage?" "My father recovered, but he could no longer handle the physical work. Someone had to keep the business going. I knew cars. I had spent my teens helping him here, so I became a mechanic." Jared smiled sadly. "Turns out, fixing cars is remarkably similar to surgery. Complex systems requiring precise diagnosis, steady hands, and patience." "But you're still a doctor," Eleanor said. "You can't just switch off that knowledge." "No, you can't," Jared agreed. "That's why when I saw you that day, when I noticed certain signs in your posture and your reflex movements, I recognized a pattern. And when I braced you during that near fall, I felt muscle resistance where there shouldn't have been any. Small, but there." Eleanor took a deep breath. "The doctors have told me for 8 years that there's no hope, that I must accept my condition and adapt my life. Why should I believe you over them?" "You shouldn't," Jared replied honestly. "At least not without evidence. That's why, if you really want to explore this, we'll need to do a full evaluation. I can't use official medical equipment. I lost those privileges, but I know manual neurological assessment techniques that are as precise as many modern tests. And if you discover there's a possibility of recovery, what then? Then I'll design a rehabilitation program. It will be intense, painful, and there are no guarantees. You could work for months and regain only a little sensation, or you could regain much more. We won't know until we try." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. This man had sacrificed a promising career for his father. He had endured the rejection of his colleagues for believing in something others considered impossible. and he had been hiding in this garage, using his magical hands to fix engines instead of saving lives. "There's something you need to understand," Eleanor said slowly. "For 8 years, I've built a life around my condition. I've accepted certain limitations. I've found power elsewhere. If you give me hope, and then that hope turns out to be false, I won't just be physically where I started. I'll be emotionally destroyed." "I know," Jared nodded. "Hope is the most dangerous emotion for someone with a spinal cord injury. That's why I don't promise miracles. I only promise honesty and my best effort. And if it works," Eleanor continued, "if I really can regain something, it will be because a mechanic did what the world's best neurosurgeon said was impossible. Do you understand how humiliating that would be for me? More humiliating than spending the rest of your life wondering if there was a chance you didn't take?" Jared asked gently. The question hit Eleanor like a punch. He was right. He was absolutely right. "All right," she said finally. "Do it. Evaluate me. And if you find something real, something that justifies this madness, I'll consider your rehabilitation program." Jared nodded and stood up. "I'll need about 2 hours. Can you stay?" Eleanor looked at her limited edition Cartier watch. She had 3 meetings scheduled that afternoon, all important for businesses handling millions of dollars. But suddenly those meetings seemed completely insignificant compared to the possibility, however remote, of recovering something she had assumed lost forever. "Cancel everything," she told Gary by phone. "I'll be here as long as necessary." While Jared prepared the space, moving Eleanor's chair to a more private area of the workshop and covering the windows for privacy, she watched his movements. They were precise, professional, the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't a mechanic playing doctor. He was a doctor disguised as a mechanic. "I'm going to need you to trust me," Jared said when he was ready. "Some of these evaluations might be uncomfortable. If at any point you want to stop, just say the word." "I won't stop," Eleanor replied with determination. "Do what you have to do." And so began one of the most extraordinary sessions Eleanor would ever experience. Over the next 2 hours, Jared performed a neurological evaluation that rivaled anything she had experienced in elite hospitals. He used his hands as diagnostic instruments, applying pressure to specific points, eliciting reflexes, evaluating microscopic muscle responses, and, slowly, methodically, he found what he was looking for. "Here." Jared pressed a specific point on her lumbar spine. "Do you feel this?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "It's small, like a distant tingle, but yes." "And this?" He moved his hand slightly lower. "Also." "Oh God, I feel that too." Jared continued, documenting every response, every sensation, every tiny sign of neurological activity that shouldn't be there according to her official medical records. When he finally finished, he sat in front of her with a serious but hopeful expression. "Miss Harrington Smythe," he began, "your injury is not complete. There are residual neurological pathways. They are weak, very weak, but they are there. With intensive rehabilitation, specifically designed to activate those pathways, there is a real chance of recovery." "How much recovery?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "I can't promise you'll walk again." Jared was brutally honest. "That would be irresponsible. But I believe we can regain significant sensation, perhaps some muscle control, and hopefully enough function to dramatically improve your quality of life." The tears Eleanor had been holding back finally fell. For 8 years, she had accepted a life sentence with no possibility of parole, and now a grease-covered mechanic was telling her there was hope. "Why?" she asked, through sobs. "Why didn't the other doctors detect this?" "Because they weren't looking," Jared replied simply. "Your initial injury was severe. Doctors saw the obvious damage and assumed it was complete. But spinal cord injuries are complex. Sometimes there are neurological pathways that survive, but enter a state of dormancy. They're not dead, just sleeping, and with the right stimulus, they can wake up." "When do we start?" Eleanor asked, wiping her tears. "That depends on you," Jared said. "The program I'll design will be brutal. Daily 3 to 4 hour sessions, painful exercises, slow and frustrating progress. There will be days when you'll want to give up, when you'll wonder if the effort is worth it." "I won't give up," Eleanor stated with a ferocity that surprised even herself. "I've survived 8 years in this chair. I can survive whatever it takes to get out of it." Jared smiled, and for the first time, Eleanor saw genuine approval in his eyes. "Good, because we're gonna need that determination. We start tomorrow. If you're ready." "I'll be ready," Eleanor promised. As Gary drove her back to her mansion that night, Eleanor looked out the window at a city she knew so well, but which suddenly seemed completely different. The world hadn't changed. She had changed. For 8 years, she had used her disability as armor and as a weapon, as an excuse to isolate herself, to justify her cruelty, to keep everyone at a distance. But this mechanic with magical hands and a secret past had just offered her something more dangerous than any threat: possibility. And Eleanor Harrington Smythe, the woman who controlled empires but couldn't control her own body, was about to discover that the real challenge wasn't physical, it was emotional. Because regaining the ability to walk would mean confronting all the reasons why she had stopped trying in the first place. The dawn of the next day found Eleanor awake. She hadn't slept. She had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of her room, processing what was about to begin. At 6 a.m., when her private nurse came in for the usual morning routine, Eleanor was already dressed in sportswear she had specially ordered for the occasion. Miss Harrington Smythe, the nurse, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, who had worked for her for 3 years, seemed genuinely surprised. "Are you going out this early?" "I'm going to the garage," Eleanor replied, applying cream to her hands with precise movements. "And Rosa, I need you to prepare my exercise room. It's going to have a different purpose now." The exercise room in Eleanor's mansion was a 200 square meters space that had been designed by the country's best physiotherapists and then abandoned after 6 months of frustrating attempts. It held state-of-the-art rehabilitation equipment, all now covered with sheets like ghosts of past hopes. "Are you sure?" Rosa asked gently. She had been present during those devastating 6 months when Eleanor had tried every conventional treatment and all had failed. She had seen the pain, the frustration, and finally, the resignation. "I've never been more sure of anything," Eleanor replied with a determination that made Rosa involuntarily step back. Yarod's garage officially opened at 8 a.m., but Eleanor arrived at 7. Yarod was already there, which didn't surprise her. There was something about this man that suggested hard yakka wasn't an obligation, but a nature. "You're early," Jared commented, walking out of his office with 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to Eleanor, who accepted it with a surprise she couldn't hide. In her world, people served her, they didn't offer. "I want to start," Eleanor admitted. "I don't want to waste another day." Yarod nodded in approval. "Good, because what I'm going to ask you to do is going to challenge everything you think you know about limits." He guided her chair to a section of the workshop that had been completely transformed overnight. Where before there had been tools and car parts, there was now a professional exercise mat, resistance bands, and several devices Eleanor recognized from her own abandoned exercise room. "Did you do all this last night?" she asked, genuinely impressed. "With help from my mechanics," Jared replied. "They know what I'm doing. In fact, 2 of them have worked with me on similar cases over the last few years." "Similar cases?" "You're number 17, Jared admitted. "Patients other doctors gave up on who found their way to this garage one way or another. Not all have succeeded, but roughly 60% have experienced some degree of recovery." The revelation left Eleanor momentarily speechless. This man had been performing medical miracles in secret from a car repair garage, helping people the official medical system had abandoned. "Why don't you do this officially?" she asked. "Why hide here?" "Because the medical system requires things I can't, or don't want to, provide," Jared replied as he prepared the space. "It requires credentials that were unfairly denied to me. It requires charging prices most of my patients could never afford. And it requires following protocols that I know from experience aren't always the best." "So, you work for free?" "I work for what people can afford," Jared corrected. "Some pay nothing, others, like you, have resources. If you choose to pay me, that money goes into a fund that helps other patients." Eleanor processed that information. In her world, everything had a price, and that price was usually exorbitant. The idea of someone providing specialized medical services for what people could afford was revolutionary and humiliating, because it meant this mechanic had something all her money couldn't buy: genuine principles. "Let's get started," Jared announced. "First assessment. I'm going to transfer you from the chair to the mat. I need you to trust me completely." Eleanor felt a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. For 8 years, transfers had been done by professional medical staff with specialized equipment. The idea of being lifted by a mechanic in a garage seemed almost absurd, but there was something in Jared's eyes that conveyed absolute competence. "All right," Eleanor nodded. Yarod approached, and his hands found specific positions on her body. On 3, he counted. 1, 2, 3. The movement was fluid, perfect, professional. In seconds, Eleanor was lying on the mat, and she hadn't felt a moment of insecurity or fear. Jared had moved her with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. "Now we're going to start with basic evaluations," Jared explained as he knelt beside her. "I'm going to touch different points on your legs and feet. I want you to tell me if you feel anything, no matter how small. Don't guess. Don't assume. Just report what you truly feel." Over the next hour, Jared performed the most exhaustive evaluation Eleanor had ever experienced. And to her growing astonishment, she felt things, not much, not always, but they were there. Small sensations of pressure, distant touches that shouldn't exist, echoes of what had once been complete sensation. "This is incredible," Eleanor whispered, after a particularly clear response. "How is this possible?" "Your spinal cord is like a motorway," Jared explained, as he worked. "The accident caused a major roadblock on that motorway, but some secondary roads survived. They're damaged, weak, but they're there. Our job is to rebuild those roads, make them stronger, create new connections." "And that's possible?" "The human brain is the most adaptable thing in the universe," Jared replied. "It can create new neurological pathways when the old ones are blocked. It's a process called neuroplasticity. Conventional medicine recognizes it, but generally underestimates its power." When the evaluation finished, Jared helped Eleanor sit up. His expression was serious but hopeful. "Good," he said. "Here's the unfiltered truth. You have more residual neurological activity than I initially thought. That's the good news. The bad news is that regaining function is going to require work that is probably more intense than anything you've done in your life." "Tell me what I have to do," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "We're going to start with neuromuscular electrical stimulation combined with intensive physical therapy. 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. The exercises will be painful. Your body is going to protest. You're going to want to give up." "I won't give up," Eleanor affirmed. Jared studied her for a long moment. "There's something else you need to understand. This process isn't just physical. You're going to have to confront the emotional reasons why your body has been clinging to this condition." "What does that mean?" "It means that sometimes the body maintains conditions because they serve a psychological purpose. I'm not saying your injury isn't real, but I'm saying that recovery will require you to explore why a part of you might be resisting healing." The suggestion initially infuriated Eleanor. "Are you saying this is psychological, that I'm choosing to be in this chair?" "No," Jared responded calmly. "I'm saying the mind and body are connected in ways Western medicine is only beginning to understand, and that true healing requires addressing both." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to defend her position, but something about the way Jared had said it made her pause. For 8 years, she had used her chair as a shield, as an excuse to control everything around her, to keep people at a distance, to justify her cruelty as a response to trauma. What if part of her really was clinging to this condition because it gave her power in a twisted way? "All right," she said finally, her voice softer. "I'll do the physical and the emotional work." Jared smiled. "Then let's get cracking. Today we're going to establish your baseline. I want to see what you can do now so we have something to compare with later." The next 90 minutes were the most physically challenging Eleanor had experienced in years. Jared guided her through exercises that activated muscles she had assumed completely dead. He used electrical stimulation to provoke muscle contractions. Then, he taught her techniques to try to replicate those contractions voluntarily. At first, nothing happened. Her legs remained completely inert no matter how hard she tried. But Jared was persistent, adjusting techniques, trying different approaches, searching for that spark of neurological connection. And then, after 40 minutes of frustrating attempts, it happened. Eleanor was concentrating intensely on her right big toe, trying to move it as Jared had instructed. She had tried this 1,000 times during the first years after the accident, always without result. But this time, with the combination of Jared's electrical stimulation and her own fierce concentration, she saw the impossible. Her toe moved. It wasn't a big movement, barely a millimeter, maybe less, but it moved. "Oh my God!" Eleanor cried out, tears instantly welling up in her eyes. "It moved! My toe moved!" Jared leaned closer, watching carefully. "Again. Try again." Eleanor concentrated all her attention, all her will, on that toe, and slowly, painfully, it moved again. This time a little more clearly. "Yes!" Jared celebrated with her, a genuine smile illuminating his face. "That's it! That's the connection we needed to find!" Eleanor was openly sobbing now. 8 years of hopelessness, pouring out in tears of something that was half relief and half absolute terror. Because if this was possible, if she really could regain function, It meant everything she had been told was a lie. It meant she had spent 8 years accepting a sentence she perhaps didn't have to accept. "It's not your fault," Jarod said gently, as if reading her mind. "The doctors worked with the information they had. They did their best, but sometimes best isn't enough." When the session ended, Eleanor was physically and emotionally exhausted. Jarod helped her back into her chair with the same professional care he had shown before. "Rest today," he instructed. "Your body needs to process what we just did. Tomorrow we continue." "Jarod." Eleanor called him before he could leave. "Thank you. Not just for this," she gestured toward the exercise mat, "but for not giving up when you saw something others didn't." Jarod nodded. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Eleanor. Even those who don't think they deserve it." The words stayed with Eleanor all the way home. She had treated Jarod with absolute contempt at their first meeting. She had threatened him, insulted him, judged him completely based on his appearance, and he had responded with compassion, with professionalism, with a gift he didn't have to give her. For the first time in 8 years, Eleanor wondered who the person looking back from the mirror really was. Over the next 3 weeks, Eleanor transformed. She arrived at Jarod's garage every morning at 7 a.m. before the other mechanics got there. She worked with an intensity that surprised even Jarod, pushing her body beyond limits she had assumed absolute. And slowly, miraculously, her body responded. The toe movement expanded to more toes. Then she began to feel stronger sensations in her feet. One memorable morning, she managed to slightly flex her ankle. They were small, microscopic victories compared to full function, but for Eleanor, they were monumental. But the real change wasn't just physical. It was in how Eleanor began to see the world and herself within it. One morning, she arrived early and found Jarod working on an old car belonging to an elderly woman in worn but clean clothes. The woman was worried, explaining she needed her car to get to her job cleaning rooms at the hospital. "I don't have much money," the woman admitted with shame. "But I can pay in installments." "The job's done," Jarod gently interrupted. "There's no charge." "But I can't accept charity," the woman protested. "It's not charity," Jarod replied with a smile. "It's an investment in my community. You look after the sick at that hospital. I look after the people in my neighborhood. We all do our bit." Eleanor watched this interaction from her car, where she was waiting for Jarod to finish, and felt something strange and unfamiliar move in her chest. Shame. Shame, for all the times she had treated acts of kindness as transactions, for all the times she had assumed people only helped when it benefited their own interests. "Do you see that often?" Eleanor asked when the woman left, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "See what?" Jarod replied, already focused on preparing the space for their session. "People who can't pay. Most of my customers can't afford what a normal garage would charge," Jarod admitted. "That's why I charge what they can. Some pay in full, some pay partially, some pay nothing. In the end, it all balances out." "That's no way to run a business," Eleanor commented, though her tone was more curious than critical. "Depends on what you define as success in a business," Jarod countered. "If it's just money, then no, it's not efficient. But if it's building a community where people look after each other, then I'm the most successful bloke I know." The philosophy was so radically different from everything Eleanor had operated on her entire life that it left her speechless. In her world, success was measured in numbers: quarterly profits, share value, return on investment. The idea that success could be measured in smiles of gratitude, in strong communities, in people helping each other, was completely alien. But as she watched Jarod work, as she saw how his other mechanics respected him, not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration, as she noted how customers returned, not because they were forced, but because they completely trusted this man, Eleanor began to question everything she had believed about worth and success. "I want to do something," Eleanor announced one afternoon after a particularly successful session, where she had managed to flex both ankles simultaneously. "What's that?" Jarod asked as he cleaned the equipment. "I want to officially fund your work. I want to create a foundation that allows you to help more people like me, people the medical system has given up on." Jarod stopped his cleaning, his expression turning cautious. "Eleanor, that's generous, but—" "No buts," Eleanor interrupted. "I've spent 8 years using my money to build walls around myself. I want to start using it to build bridges, to help others. And your work deserves resources it doesn't have." "And what would you want in return?" Jarod asked, clearly expecting there to be conditions. "Nothing," Eleanor replied simply. "Only that you continue doing what you do, helping people others have abandoned, proving that miracles are possible when someone refuses to accept limitations." Jarod studied her for a long moment, as if evaluating whether this change in Eleanor was genuine or temporary. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but with a condition of my own, which is that you work in the foundation, not just funding it, but involved, meeting the patients, understanding their stories, because I believe that will be part of your own healing." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. Jared was right. For 8 years, she had been locked in her ivory tower, isolated from real humanity. Maybe it was time to reconnect. "I accept," she said. That decision changed everything. Over the following weeks, Eleanor not only continued her intensive rehabilitation, but she began to get involved in the lives of the other people Jared was helping. She met Robbie, a 20-year-old who had been paralyzed after being shot in a robbery. She met Lena, a mother of 3 who had suffered a car accident and had been told she would never feel her legs again. She met Marco, an elderly man who had had a stroke and was slowly regaining motor function. Each story was different, but all shared the same theme: people the official medical system had given up on, but who had found hope in the magical hands of a mechanic who refused to accept impossible as the final answer. And Eleanor learned something fundamental. Her pain wasn't unique. Her struggle wasn't special. It was part of a community of people fighting against limitations others had imposed on them. "You know what the hardest thing is?" Lena told her one afternoon, as they both did rehab exercises side by side in the garage. "It's not the physical pain. It's the way people look at you, like you're not fully human anymore." Eleanor felt those words like a punch, because for 8 years, she had looked at others exactly like that. She had reduced people to their jobs, their bank accounts, their usefulness to her. She hadn't seen them as fully human. "I was like that," Eleanor admitted softly. "I used to look at people and only see labels. Mechanic, cleaner, driver. I never saw the whole person behind those labels." "And now?" Lena asked curiously. "Now I see I was the most disabled of all. Not in my body, but in my humanity." It was that same week that Eleanor made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She called an emergency meeting of the board of directors of Harrington Resources, the company her family had built over 3 generations. The boardroom on the 45th floor of the city's tallest corporate building was filled with men and women in expensive suits, all watching Eleanor with mixtures of curiosity and concern. Rumors had been circulating about changes in her behavior, about visits to a car garage, about strange investments in unconventional rehabilitation programs. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her chair positioned at the head of the 20-meter mahogany table. "For the past 8 years, I have run this company from a position of isolation. I have made decisions based solely on profit margins, without considering the human impact of those decisions." The silence in the room was absolute. No one had ever heard Eleanor admit to vulnerability or error. "Recently," she continued, "I've learned some important lessons about worth, about purpose, about what true success really means. And I've decided to make significant changes in how we operate as a company." "What kind of changes?" asked Richard Morrison, the CFO who had worked with the Harrington family for 20 years. "First, we're going to establish a medicine access program for people who can't afford full prices. Second, we're going to invest 30% of our annual profits into research for treatments for conditions that are generally ignored because they aren't profitable enough. And third, we're going to partner with community clinics to provide accessible medical care in underserved areas." The ensuing murmur was one of shock and disapproval. The director of operations, a man named Thomas Bradford, spoke with a tense voice. Harrington Smythe, with all due respect, those proposals would reduce our profits by approximately 40%. The shareholders will never accept it." "The shareholders will accept it because I am the majority shareholder," Eleanor replied calmly. "And I have decided that this company is going to do more than generate wealth. It's going to generate hope." "This is madness." Bradford stood up, his face flushed. "What's happened to you? Is this the mechanic everyone's talking about? Has he brainwashed you?" "On the contrary," Eleanor replied, and for the first time, a genuine smile appeared on her face. "He has helped me see clearly, for the first time in my life, and what I see is that I've been measuring success with the wrong metrics." "Then maybe you shouldn't be running this company," Bradford challenged. "Perhaps you're right," Eleanor agreed, surprising everyone. "Perhaps it's time this company was run by someone who understands that medicine shouldn't be a business that prioritizes profits over lives." The meeting ended in chaos. 3 board members resigned immediately. Others threatened legal battles, but Eleanor held her position firm. And to her surprise, some board members, especially the younger ones, expressed support. "My father worked for your grandfather," said Jennifer Chen, a 35-year-old executive who had recently been promoted. He always spoke about how the company used to have a soul, used to care about people. I'm glad to see it returning to those roots. That night, Eleanor returned to Jared's garage. He was closing up, cleaning the tools of the day, and preparing everything for tomorrow. When he saw her enter, he immediately noticed something different in her expression. "What happened?" he asked. "I've just possibly destroyed the family business," Eleanor replied. But she was smiling. "And ironically, I've never been prouder of myself." She told him about the meeting, the proposals, the resignations, and the chaos. Jared listened in silence, wiping motor oil from his hands as she spoke. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Eleanor asked when she finished. "Does it matter what I think?" Jared countered. "Yes, it matters a lot." Jared sat down on a metal stool, his eyes meeting hers. "I think you did the right thing, but I also think it was the easy decision." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Easy? How can risking a family empire be easy?" "Because money has always been abstract for you," Jared explained. "You've never had to worry about the rent, about putting food on the table, about choosing between medicine and electricity. Deciding to use your wealth to help others is noble, but it doesn't really cost you anything on a personal level." The words hurt precisely because they were true. So, what would be the difficult decision? Changing how you treat the people you encounter every day. Confronting the prejudices you've held all your life. Learning to see dignity in every person, regardless of their job or their bank account. That's the hard bit. Eleanor processed that in silence. Jared was right. It had been relatively easy to write a big check or change corporate policies. The difficult part was changing her own heart. "Teach me," she said finally. "Teach you what?" "How to see people the way you see them. How to find worth where I've been blind to it my whole life." Jared smiled. "You're already learning. Every day you come here, every conversation you have with Robbie or Lena or Marco, every moment you choose humility over arrogance, you're learning." It was at that moment when one of the other mechanics, a young bloke around 25 named Andy, approached shyly. "Excuse me, Miss Harrington Smythe," he began nervously. "I just wanted to say, what you're doing with the pharma company, it matters. My sister has diabetes. She can't afford her insulin completely. She's been rationing it, putting herself at risk. If your program can help people like her, you're going to save lives." Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes. For 8 years, she had run a pharmaceutical company without really thinking about the real lives affected by her decisions. She had seen numbers on spreadsheets, not people like Andy's sister struggling to survive. "What's your sister's name?" Eleanor asked. "Maria," Andy replied, surprised by the question. "I want to meet her, and I want to make sure she has all the insulin she needs, starting tomorrow." Andy looked like he was about to cry. "Mom, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Eleanor replied softly. "Thank Jared for teaching me to see people instead of numbers." After Andy left, Jared and Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment. "You know what the strangest thing is?" Eleanor finally spoke. "For the first time in 8 years, I don't feel defined by this chair. I feel defined by who I'm choosing to be." "That's because you're healing," Jared observed. "Not just your body, though that's progressing incredibly too, but you're healing the parts of you that were broken long before the accident." The words resonated deeply with Eleanor. She had assumed her main trauma was the polo accident, the spinal cord injury, but now she was beginning to see that she had been wounded long before that. Wounded by a life of privilege that had isolated her from real humanity, by years of learning that money was more important than people, by an education that had taught her to measure worth in material terms. "Jared," Eleanor said softly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Do you ever regret leaving medicine, sacrificing your career for your father?" Jared considered the question carefully. "Before, yes. The first few years were rough. I'd see my residency mates advancing in their careers, becoming the successful neurosurgeons I had planned to be. I wondered if I'd wasted my potential. And now? Now I see I wasted nothing. I just took a different path. I've helped more people from this garage than I would have helped in an elite hospital where only the rich have access. I've built a community based on mutual care instead of financial transactions. And I've learned that true success isn't measured in titles or prestige, but in lives touched and hearts changed." "You're the wisest person I've ever met," Eleanor admitted. "I'm not wise," Jared laughed. "I'm just someone who learned his lessons the hard way and decided not to waste the pain." It was during that conversation that Eleanor realized something fundamental. She had fallen for Jared, not necessarily in a romantic way, although there were elements of that too, but in a deeper way. She had fallen for his way of seeing the world, his unwavering compassion, his refusal to let the system define what was possible. But more importantly, she had fallen for who she was becoming under his influence. The cruel, bitter woman she had been was slowly dying, replaced by someone Eleanor barely recognized, but liked infinitely more. 2 months after their first meeting, Jarod decided Eleanor was ready for the next level of her rehabilitation. Today, he announced with a smile that made his eyes sparkle, "We're going to try something you'll probably think is completely bonkers." "After everything we've done, nothing would surprise me," Eleanor replied. "We're going to try to get you standing." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor felt as if the whole world had stopped. "Standing?" she finally whispered. "Jarod, is that possible?" "It is," Jarod completed. "You've been making incredible progress. You have sensation in most of your legs, you have partial muscle control in your ankles, knees, even some function in your hips. It's time to see if we can turn those small victories into something bigger." "But what if I fall? What if I hurt myself?" "You won't fall because I'll be holding you, and you won't get hurt because I'll be there every second. Trust me, Eleanor." And she completely trusted him. This man had taken her from hopelessness to hope, from resignation to possibility. If he said she could stand, then she would try. Jarod prepared everything meticulously. He installed parallel bars he had built specifically for this moment. He positioned safety mats. He called 2 of his most experienced mechanics to help as extra support. "All right." Jarod knelt in front of Eleanor, his hands finding familiar positions on her legs. "We'll do this in stages. First, I'm going to help you stand up. I'll be supporting most of your weight. Your job is simply to try to activate the muscles we've been rehabbing. Ready?" "Ready," Eleanor replied, though her voice trembled. Jarod moved her carefully from her chair to a position between the parallel bars. His hands held her waist firmly as he slowly, centimetre by centimetre, guided her to a vertical position. And then, for the first time in 8 years, Eleanor Harrington Smythe was standing. Jarod held most of her weight, and her legs trembled violently with the effort, but she was vertical. She was looking Jarod in the eye instead of looking up. She was experiencing a perspective she had assumed lost forever. Tears streamed down her face, but she barely noticed them. All her focus was on maintaining this position, on activating every muscle Jarod had taught her to awaken. "That's it," Jarod encouraged her, his voice soft but firm. "Feel your feet against the ground. Feel your weight distributing through your legs. Your body remembers how to do this. You just need to remind it." Eleanor concentrated with an intensity that bordered on the mystical, and to her absolute amazement, she felt something. Her legs weren't just hanging uselessly, but supporting a small but real fraction of her. "I feel it," she exclaimed. "I'm holding part of my weight." "Yes," Jarod celebrated. "That's exactly what I wanted to see. Now I'm going to reduce my support a tiny bit, only a little. I want you to try to maintain your balance." He reduced his grip slightly, and Eleanor felt her muscles protesting fiercely against the additional work, but she held on shaky, unstable, but standing. It lasted only 30 seconds, but they were the 30 most miraculous seconds of Eleanor's life. When Jarod finally helped her back into her chair, she was sobbing uncontrollably. "I stood up," she kept repeating. "I really stood up." The other mechanics who had witnessed the moment were applauding. Some had tears in their own eyes, because they had all seen Eleanor when she first arrived, arrogant and cruel, and they had all been witnesses to her transformation. "This is just the beginning," Jarod told her, kneeling in front of her and taking her hands. "With practice, you'll be able to stand for longer periods. Eventually, with the right support, you might even be able to take steps." "Steps?" Eleanor could barely pronounce the word. "I'm not promising you'll walk independently," Jarod was careful to clarify. "But I think we can get to where you can walk with assistance. A walker. Maybe eventually just canes. It won't be easy. It will take months, perhaps years, but it is possible." Eleanor hugged him then, not caring that he was covered in motor grease, not caring that the tears were staining his overalls. All that mattered was this incredible man who had refused to accept impossible as an answer. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I never give up on people who are willing to fight for themselves," Jarod replied, gently returning the hug. "And you, Eleanor, you're a fighter." The following weeks were a roller coaster of emotions and discoveries. Eleanor practiced standing every day, gradually increasing the time she could support her own weight. 20 seconds became 30. 30 became a minute, and then, on a memorable day, she held her position for 5 full minutes. But the real challenge came when Jarod announced the next step. "It's time to try a step," he said one morning after Eleanor had managed to stand for nearly 10 minutes with minimal support. A step. Eleanor felt terror and excitement, mixing in equal proportions. "Jarod, standing is one thing, but moving my legs." "I know." Jarod nodded. "It's exponentially more complex. It requires coordination, balance, and strength you're still developing, but I think you're ready to try." He prepared a system of safety harnesses that would support her if she lost balance. He positioned the parallel bars so she had something to hold on to, and then, with infinite patience, he began to teach her the biomechanics of taking a step. "Walking is basically controlled falling forward," he explained. "You transfer your weight to one leg, lift the other slightly, move it forward, and then transfer the weight again. Your brain used to do this automatically. Now we have to consciously teach it every single element." The first attempt was an absolute failure. Eleanor managed to stand. She managed to transfer her weight to her right leg, but when she tried to lift her left leg, her muscles simply refused to cooperate. She would have fallen if Jarod hadn't supported her. "Again," Eleanor ordered, fierce determination in her voice. "Your body needs a rest," Jarod warned. "Again," Eleanor repeated, and Jarod recognized that expression. It was the same one he had seen in dozens of patients who were about to achieve the impossible. Pure, unbreakable will. They tried again and again and again. For 2 hours, Eleanor tried to take a single step, and each time she failed. But with each failure, she learned something. Her muscles gradually remembered how to coordinate. Her brain rebuilt neurological connections that had been dormant for years. And then, on the 37th attempt, it happened. Eleanor was standing at the parallel bars, her weight on her right leg. She took a deep breath, visualizing the movement as Jarod had taught her. And then, with a concentration so intense she could feel sweat forming on her forehead, she lifted her left leg. It wasn't a smooth lift. Her foot dragged along the floor with obvious resistance. But it moved forward barely 10 centimeters. But it moved, and when it touched the ground again, Eleanor was standing in a new position. She had taken a step. Her first step in 8 years. The workshop erupted in celebration. All the mechanics had been watching, their own jobs forgotten in favor of witnessing this miracle. Andy was openly crying. Even the tough 60-year-old veteran named Carlos had tears in his eyes, but no one was more emotional than Jarod. His smile was so wide, it lit up the entire room. "You did it," he exclaimed. "You took a step." "Only one," Eleanor laughed through her tears. "And the ugliest, clumsiest step anyone has ever taken," Jarod replied with complete sincerity, "is the most beautiful step I've ever seen in my life. Because it's a step the world's best doctors said you'd never take." Eleanor looked at this man who had completely transformed her, not just her body, though that was miraculous in itself, but her soul. He had forced her to confront who she had been, who she wanted to be, and the distance between those two versions of herself. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. "You're wrong," Jarod replied. "I only showed you the way. You did all the hard yakka." Over the next 2 months, Eleanor worked tirelessly to perfect that step. 1 step became 2, 2 became 3, and then, in a moment that would be etched into her memory forever, she walked 5 full meters with minimal support from Jarod. It wasn't normal walking. Each step required intense concentration. Her right foot dragged slightly. Her balance was precarious, but she was walking really, genuinely walking. But as her body transformed, Eleanor realized there was another challenge to face: the outside world. For months, her rehabilitation had been private, contained within the safe confines of Jarod's garage. But now it was time to confront the society that had known her only as the disabled woman in the titanium wheelchair. The opportunity came when the city's Chamber of Commerce invited her to give the keynote speech at their annual gala. It was an event Eleanor had religiously avoided for 8 years. The idea of being exhibited in her chair, of being the object of pity or performative admiration, had been intolerable. But now something had changed. "I'm going to attend," Eleanor told her assistant Margaret by phone. "And Margaret, don't mention my chair in any promotional material. In fact, don't mention my condition at all." "Are you sure?" Margaret asked, clearly confused. "It's been your brand for years, the successful CEO who overcame adversity." "I don't want to be defined by my disability," Eleanor replied. "I want to be defined by what I'm doing now." The night of the gala, Eleanor, dressed with a care she hadn't used in years. She chose a long dress that would cover her legs, but which was elegant rather than functional. She applied makeup not to hide but to highlight. She styled her hair in a way that spoke of confidence rather than control. And when it was time to enter the ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, Eleanor did something no one expected. She arrived walking. She used a specialized walker that Jared had modified for her. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but she was walking, and the effect on the room was electric. The murmur of conversations instantly stopped. All heads turned, and for a moment, there was absolute silence as 500 people processed the impossible. Eleanor Harrington Smythe, whom everyone had known as permanently confined to a wheelchair, was walking. And then, as if someone had given an invisible signal, the room erupted in thunderous applause. It wasn't the polite applause of corporate events. It was something more visceral, more genuine. It was the recognition of having witnessed something extraordinary. But Eleanor raised a hand to silence them, and gradually, the applause died down. "Please," she said when the room was silent. "Don't applaud me for walking. Applaud the man who refused to accept the word impossible as a final answer." She gestured to where Jared was standing by the entrance, dressed in the only suit he owned, clearly uncomfortable among all this wealth and prestige. He had insisted on not coming, but Eleanor had convinced him by telling him that tonight wasn't about her, but about honoring his work. "Jared O'Connell," Eleanor continued, her voice resonating in the hall. "He's a mechanic. He fixes cars in a humble garage in Merrickville, but he's also something more. He's a brilliant neurosurgeon who left his career to care for his father. He's a healer who helps people the official medical system has abandoned. And he is the reason I am standing here tonight." She could see faces in the audience shifting from expressions of curiosity to understanding, to something that might have been shame, because many of them, in different ways, had contributed to a system that valued credentials over capability, that measured success in dollars instead of changed lives. "For 8 years, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength, "I was the disabled CEO who supposedly inspired others, but the truth is, I was a bitter woman who used her disability as an excuse to treat others with cruelty. I used my chair as a weapon and as armor." The silence in the room was now uncomfortable. No one expected this kind of brutal honesty at a corporate gala. But Jared taught me something fundamental. That true disability isn't physical. It's the inability to see humanity in others. It's the inability to recognize worth beyond titles and bank accounts. It's the inability to grow, to change, and to become a better person. Eleanor paused, allowing the words to resonate. "Tonight, I'm announcing the O'Connell Foundation for Alternative Rehabilitation. It will be funded with $100 of my personal fortune. Its mission will be to provide treatment and hope to people with spinal cord injuries who have been given up on by conventional medicine." The applause that followed was different from the first. It was more sober, more thoughtful, because everyone in that room knew Eleanor had just fundamentally challenged the medical status quo. "But this isn't just about money," Eleanor continued when the applause subsided. "It's about changing how we value people. It's about recognizing that brilliance can exist in a car garage just as much as in a corporate tower. It's about understanding that true success is measured in lives touched, not in profits accumulated." She looked directly at Jared, who had tears streaming down his face. "Jared gave me the ability to walk again, but more importantly, he gave me the ability to see clearly, to feel deeply, to live authentically. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a gift no money can buy." When her speech ended, Eleanor walked slowly from the podium to where Jared was standing. Each step was visible effort, but she took them with dignity and purpose. And when she finally reached him, she took his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Jared didn't trust his voice to reply, so he simply hugged her, as the entire room stood in ovation. But for Eleanor, the real moment came later, when a young woman timidly approached her. It was Andy's sister, Maria, the one with diabetes. "Miss Harrington Smythe." Maria spoke with a trembling voice. "I just wanted to say, the medicine access program you started literally saved my life. And now, seeing what you did for yourself, it gives all of us hope. Hope that real change is possible." Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes. For 8 years, she had run a pharmaceutical company without truly thinking about the real people affected by her decisions. She had seen numbers on spreadsheets, not people like Andy's sister struggling to survive. During the following months, Eleanor's life transformed not just for herself, but for the entire city. The O'Connell Foundation opened its doors with Jared as medical director, but he insisted on one condition, that he continue working at his garage 3 days a week, because, as he explained, that's where he found his best ideas, surrounded by engines and the honest work of his mechanics. The foundation employed the best physiotherapists, neurologists, and rehabilitation specialists money could buy, but all worked under Jared's philosophy: Never accept impossible as a final answer. Never give up on a patient. Never let the limitations of the medical system dictate what was possible. Eleanor continued her own rehabilitation. 6 months after her first step, she was walking with only a cane. Her gait would never be completely normal. She would always have a slight limp in her right leg, but she was mobile, she was independent, and, most importantly, she was completely transformed. She had donated the majority of her fortune to various causes, keeping only enough to live comfortably, but not ostentatiously. Her mansion had been converted into a residential rehabilitation center, where patients could stay during their intensive treatments. Her fleet of luxury cars had been sold, the money used to buy specialized medical equipment. And she, the woman who had once measured her worth in bank account digits, now measured her life in the smiles of patients taking their first steps, in the tears of families reunited with renewed hope, in the simple satisfaction of knowing that every day she made a real difference. The car garage remained open. Jared insisted on keeping it running, not only for the modest income it generated, but because it was there, surrounded by honest work and the smell of motor oil, that he found clarity and purpose. His mechanics, many of whom were now also certified rehabilitation technicians, split their time between fixing cars and helping to fix lives. One spring afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the garage and found Jared working on an old car. It was a model she immediately recognized, the same Porsche Cayenne that Gary had brought 5 years ago, the one that had started this whole extraordinary story. "That car?" she asked with a smile. Jared slid out from under the vehicle, his face now marked with lines that spoke of 5 years of intense but satisfying work. "The owner never picked it up. It was abandoned here. I was thinking of fixing it up and donating it." Eleanor walked closer, her steps now completely confident, though she still used a decorative cane more out of caution than necessity. She caressed the bonnet of the car that had witnessed the beginning of her transformation. "We should keep it," she said softly, as a reminder of where we started. Jared stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that immediately made them dirtier. That gesture that had once seemed to Eleanor like evidence of inferiority, she now saw as the mark of someone unafraid to get their hands dirty doing important work. "You know what the most extraordinary thing about these 5 years is?" Jared asked, leaning against the car. "What?" "It's not the number of patients we've helped, though that's incredible. It's not the recognition the foundation has received, though that's also gratifying. It's how your transformation inspired chain transformations we never could have anticipated." It was true. Eleanor's story had become legendary. Articles had been written, documentaries filmed, conferences given, but more importantly, it had inspired others to confront their own prejudices, to question their own assumptions about worth and capability. Corporate executives had begun genuine inclusion programs instead of performative ones. Schools had reviewed how they assessed talent and potential. Even the medical system, resistant to change as it was, had begun to adopt more holistic and personalized approaches. "I still have tough days," Eleanor admitted, sitting on a nearby stool. "Days where my body aches, where walking is a challenge, where I wonder if all the effort is worth it." "That's completely normal," Jared replied, sitting beside her. "Healing isn't linear. It's a process with ups and downs. The important thing is that now you have tools to handle those tough days. Tools you gave me. Tools you found inside yourself. I just showed you where to look." They stood in silence for a moment, a comfortable silence that only comes from years of deep friendship and mutual respect. "Jared," Eleanor finally spoke, "do you ever think about how improbable all this was? An arrogant woman laughing at a mechanic who promised the impossible. The odds of this ending well were astronomically low." Jared smiled, that smile she had learned to love as a symbol of wisdom and kindness. "Perhaps that's the most important lesson, Mate. That miracles aren't random events that happen to lucky people. They are the result of people refusing to accept limitations, working tirelessly, believing when no one else believes. You believed when I couldn't, and you worked when I couldn't work for myself. It was collaboration, Eleanor, like everything important in life." As the afternoon sun painted the workshop with golden light, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary journey they had shared. From arrogance to humility, from hopelessness to hope, from isolation to community, from spiritual death to complete rebirth. And she knew with absolute certainty that although her legs had been healed, that had never been the real wound. The real wound had been her closed heart, her inability to see humanity in others, her belief that money and status made her superior. That wound had been healed not by medicine or surgery, but by the persistent kindness of a man who saw potential where others saw impossibility, by a mechanic with magical hands who understood that true healing requires touching not just the body, but the soul. And as Eleanor stood up to leave, walking on legs that were once immobile, supported by strength that was once non-existent, guided by purpose that was once lost, she knew that every step she took was a testament to a fundamental truth. Miracles exist, but they don't come from the outside. They come from the decision to believe, to work, to change, to become something greater than what we were before. The mechanic had said, "I'll have you walking again, Mate." And she had laughed, but it hadn't been a lie, it had been prophecy. Only, walking had meant much more than moving legs. It had meant walking towards an authentic life, towards real purpose, towards the person she always had the potential to be, but whom privilege and trauma had kept sleeping. And now, finally, after 5 years of hard yakka and painful transformation, Eleanor Harrington Smythe was completely awake, completely alive, completely herself. The journey had begun with cruel laughter and ended with deep gratitude. And that, Eleanor knew, was the most beautiful story she could ever tell.